So thank you all for coming this afternoon, and welcome to the IISS-US, the Washington home of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. My name is Sam Charap. I'm the Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the IISS. And I'm very pleased to welcome today Vasily Mikheyev to my left, the Deputy Director of the Primakov Institute for World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences, commonly known by its acronym EMMO. And Kurt Campbell, CEO of the Asia Group and former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific Affairs. And just a word of warning, Kurt has to leave a bit early. It's not your questions that will force that event, but his schedule. And we're here today to launch this report, which hopefully you all have been given a copy of by now, the U.S. and Russia in the Asia Pacific, which is a joint effort of the IISS and EMMO. So I'm going to start today by telling you a bit about the background of the project and outlining the main recommendations of the report, and then I'll hand it over to Vasily, one of the principal authors of this document, who will talk about recent developments in Russia's Asia policy, and Kurt then will provide his perspective, and we'll have a discussion and a Q&A. So the report is a culmination of 2 years of joint work, both between the IISS and EMMO, and among a broader group of American and Russian Asia experts that we convened. The full list of those who participated in the meetings are included in the report, but I should emphasize that only the authors are responsible for its contents. I also would like to thank Carnegie Corporation of New York for the support that made this effort possible. The project was conceived in 2013, at a time when the U.S.-Russia relationship was certainly not great, but nowhere near as troubled as it is today. At that time, our assumption was that there was an opportunity for the United States and Russia to cooperate substantially on issues of mutual concern and mutual interest in the Asia Pacific. But by the time we first met, it was March 2014, and U.S.-Russia relations had changed dramatically for the worse. In the report, we do not debate that downturn in relations. And we accept it as the reality that exists today and that the governments are operating within. But there are three other important realities that made our discussions and joint work very much worthwhile. The first is that the U.S. and Russia are both Pacific powers. They are key actors in regional diplomatic processes and multilateral fora. Their militaries in the theater have capabilities that no other state can match. The second is that both countries' leadership sees the future prosperity and security of their countries, respectively, as fundamentally linked to developments in the Asia-Pacific region. And the third is that if you compare the Asia-Pacific to other regions, particularly the Euro-Atlantic, but also the Middle East, the United States and Russia's interests that overlap are more pronounced than their divergences. The analysis in the report certainly acknowledges that differences do exist, but we conclude that, particularly in comparison to other regions, there are relatively few major contradictions in U.S. and Russian approaches to the region. The point here is that the fundamental divide that does exist between the U.S. and Russia, beginning in February 2014 regarding Ukraine, does not change those three realities. But it does clearly limit the extent to which the two governments are willing to work together in the region. So I'll briefly outline the policy recommendations in the report, which sort of fall under the broad rubric of conflict avoidance. And I should add that the policy recommendations are directed to both governments. EMMO will be publishing a Russian version of this text and will present it in Moscow as well. So the first recommendation is that the governments not allow their disputes in other regions to define their interaction in the Asia Pacific. We argue that neither side benefits from this kind of negative linkage. The U.S. and Russia might have disagreements in Asia, but those disagreements should be about Asia. Second, we argue that neither country should explicitly put issues related to the Ukraine crisis on the agenda of Asia-Pacific multilateral forums, such as the EAS, APEC, the six-party talks, and so on. There would be no benefit to injecting it into an already very complex regional agenda. The third is we call for both sides to increase mutual military transparency in the region. The U.S.-Russia tradition of transparency measures that dates from the Soviet era is much more active and present in the Euro-Atlantic than it is in this region. The fourth is that we advise both governments to not attempt to use their respective relations with China against one another. Such attempts have been made in the last 2 years by both countries, and none of them worked because China won't allow itself to be used in this way. So it's a wasted effort with some significant downside potential for the bilateral relationship. Fifth, we recommend dialogue on evolving regional economic integration initiatives, particularly the TPP, in order to reduce misunderstandings. Clearly, Russia is not going to join the TPP in the short to medium term, but the U.S. can minimize misperceptions by being as transparent with Moscow about the TPP as the ratification process allows, and by maintaining an open door in the long term for the prospect of Russian membership. We have a second category of recommendations in the report, which we call long-term priorities, and these are sort of steps to consider for the future if and when the bilateral relationship improves significantly, and I'm happy to address those in the Q&A. But for now, I'll hand it over to Vasily. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam. First of all, I would like to thank a lot Sam for his enthusiasm to push the work to prepare this joint paper. One of our goals was to show that Russian and American experts can work together, even if the relationship between the countries are not so good. So IMMO is providing a series of projects with Americans. Last December we presented our joint work with Atlantic Council on the Global Trends 2035 here in Washington in February, in London in April. It will be presented in Moscow. Last February, a month and so ago, we started trilateral project with Americans and Japanese on how to cooperate. And what we did with Sam, it's very significant for, I think, for our political and intellectual elites. So as we agreed when we worked out scenario of our meeting now, I will talk a little bit about Russian policy towards East Asia, maybe sometimes beyond the paper we offer to you. So first, Russian shift to Asia Pacific. It was determined not only by the deterioration of Russia relations with the United States and European Union, it was also logical move by Russian government, because Russia is located in two areas, Europe and Asia. But until recently, Russian government didn't pay much attention to our relations with Asia countries. So it's not, of course, it was pushed by the Crimea and the Ukrainian situation, but this shift also has its own logic. Second, what Russia tries to do, to use institutions which exist in Asia Pacific. What is positive? Positive is Russian attempts to be more active in APEC. After 2012, when the APEC summit was organized in Vladivostok, Russian officials started to pay more attention to Asia countries and to talk about cooperation, not only with our traditional partners in Northeast Asia, China, Japan, South Korea, but also ASEAN countries and even Australia, New Zealand. What is not so good? This is TPP. You know, the Russian government perceived TTP very nervously. Some people in Russian government see that it's I don't know why, it's anti-Russian step, it's anti-Chinese step and so on. But now the atmosphere starts to change a little bit. And now the main trend is let's wait and see what will happen with TTP. Practically, it will be in work not earlier than 2 years. And the Russians even asked for more information about TTP. So I think here, in regard to the TTP, it's important to inform official Russian authorities about what the organization is doing. Nevertheless, Russia tries to look for alternatives to TTP. First of all, it's cooperation with China in the Silk Road process, so-called Continental Eurasian free trade area. But the problem is that China's attitude to TTP is already changing from absolutely negative to what we can get from this group. So I think these are two ways of thinking. What can be used for Russia or what is against Russian interest. These two ways of in Asia, these two ways of thinking prevail, compete in Russian foreign policy and determine the practical steps. Now, my next point, what Russia is doing, it tries to increase its presence in Asia Pacific, not only by economic means, but not only by cooperation with China, but also by military presence. Just recently, our defense ministry declared its plans about deployment of military facilities in the Kuril Islands and increased number of military exercises. It's not aimed against any particular enemy, but it's just to show that Russia is here. My next point is about Russia relations with the main countries. With China, two approaches. China will substitute our relations with the West with Europe. It's how to say, it's idealistic approach. The realistic approach, China is a very important partner, but it cannot substitute for our relations with the West. It's additional channel of Russian foreign activity. It's our additional partner. And it is true because we have good relations with China, but our relations are not so smooth. Last year, our trade declined by more than 30%, of course, due to prices on oil and devaluation of Russian ruble. But anyway, it's the fact. And the Ukrainian crisis a little bit, not a little bit, but just corrected Chinese plans in the framework of the Silk Road concept. Before, Russia was the main route because Russia, Ukraine, Europe. Russia, Belarus, Europe. Now, Russia, Ukraine, Europe is closed. Russia, Belarus, Europe. So this route is very important, but it doesn't have a top priority in Chinese plans. They work out another route with the 16 East European countries, the former socialist countries, Bulgaria, Hungary, and so on. And another route is Kazakhstan and Pakistan, and further maybe India into the Indian Sea. Yes, we have big potential in economic cooperation. First of all, based on this Silk Road project, and it will work sooner or later. We have good political cooperation, with big exchanges between our presidents and other high-level officials. But on the other hand, we have some points where our interests do not coincide each other. For example, China did not support politically Russia on the Crimea. They didn't impose sanctions, but they did it because of China's own economic interests. But they did not support this because of, it's very understandable, they refocused the situation in Crimea on the situation in China, Xinjiang, Tibet, and so on. Russia does not support China on Vietnam-China dispute. You know, when Russia doesn't want to be involved in China-Japanese territorial dispute. So, with China, we have normal relations between two big countries. Good is good, very important partner, neighbor, so on. On the other hand, we have some points of contradiction and competition. It's also natural. About Japan and Korea, in Russia, some people see in economic terms Japan and South Korea as some kind of balance to growing China economic influence in Russia. It's also natural approach. About North Korean situation, Russian position in regard to nuclear non-proliferation is very firm and very clear. No nuclear North Korea, no nuclear North Korea. Here we absolutely are absolutely on the same side with the United States and China. But our differences are in how to prevent, how to influence on North Korean regime so to make him stop this nuclear issue. And finally, Russian position on the South China Sea. At the moment, it's neutral because Russia doesn't have direct interest in this area. We have relations with Vietnam, but as I have just said, if there are problems in Vietnam-China relations, Russian approach to the situation in South China Sea is very complicated, and Russia tries not to interfere. So finally, I would like to say is that in my view, and we tried to discuss it in the paper and even give strategic recommendations, that Russia and the United States are not enemies in Asia Pacific. We are not direct competitors in this area. Moreover, we have joint fields of security interest which we can use both for our cooperation and for the regional peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vasily. Kurt?
Thanks. First of all, welcome everyone this afternoon, and let me also welcome Vasily and his colleagues here to Washington, and I want to join Vasily in complimenting Sam on really tirelessly implementing a project that was hard to pull off. And really, Vasily and Sam had a vision of how to create a track to dialogue on issues of mutual concern, and they pulled it off. And I'm very grateful for it, and I think it is in the best interest of the United States to support these kinds of track two dialogues. In fact, track two dialogues really came about during the Cold War for precisely circumstances and situations like this, when the two governments, or at least the United States and Russia in the current context, are unable or unwilling to talk about certain issues, finding venues like this to explore issues of mutual concern. So I think it's terrific, and my hope is that this effort will continue, and I want to commend the Carnegie Corporation of New York for having the vision and wisdom to support such an effort. I participate personally in a couple of these different venues. One is this dialogue that Sam has ably chaired and steered. The other is a CSIS dialogue that brings together unofficially the United States, Russia, and Japan to talk about the future of the Asia-Pacific region. My own personal view that at a strategic level, it is not in the best strategic interest of the United States to have Russia's dominant avenue of entry into Asia only through China, and that we have a strategic interest to find areas where the two countries can work together on issues of mutual interest. And my own personal experience working closely with Russia during my time at the State Department is that there are in fact a number of issues. I think Vasily, if anything, underestimates areas where quietly there was and continues to be some degree of dialogue and cooperation between the United States and Russia. So let me just put aside here for a moment the discussion of Ukraine. I think we all understand that the larger dominant storyline is because of issues there. It makes certain official interactions between Moscow and Washington either impossible or difficult. I'm not going to quarrel with that set of suppositions at the outset. I will, however, suggest that we have to be thinking about the future and have to be thinking about areas over time that we can develop more dialogue and cooperation. I think about this, my first boss is here, Bob Nurek. When I was at the ISS, I think about 70 years ago, we worked together, and it was one of the issues that he worked on then with respect to the United States and the former Soviet Union. So I want to just illuminate a couple of areas that I think are in our best interest to continue to explore over time based on previous experience. The first, Vasily is being too modest about the six-party talks. In fact, in critical behind-the-scenes interactions. Russia has provided in the past absolutely unique commentary about developments in North Korea. They continue to have certain insights that almost no country has. And in fact, in recent years, given the lack of dialogue in certain arenas between China and North Korea, in fact, Russian interactions are important, and those assessments about personnel and key players, particularly on the military and party side, have been particularly helpful. I will also say, again, as Vasily underscored, that their commitment to a non-nuclear Korean peninsula is strong. And they are prepared to take very firm steps with respect to UN sanctions after certain kinds of misbehavior. And in fact, our position has been closer to Russia on many circumstances than to China. And in fact, even some of our closer partners had wobbliness occasionally. Russia has been very firm, and when once shown the evidence after the sinking of the Chonan, was clear about their apprehensions associated with a mounting tension associated with North Korean provocations. Second, I hear Vasily's point about not having a particular issue with respect to the South China Sea, but in fact, the Russian position generally on freedom of navigation, now that we have, kind of seen some distance between us and the Cold War, has been relatively helpful and positive. And I believe that over time, Russia can help China to better understand its strategic interests and appreciate that what we are dealing with in Asia is an operating system, and that the more that there are attempts to constrain that operating system, and rather than thinking about the South China Sea as this completely irrelevant area of water. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. By some measurements, about 40 to 50% of global commerce by tonnage passes through the South China Sea per year, and about 30 to 40 by value. So it's significant. It's very significant. And I think Russian friends understand that the idea that to define this 9,000 square mile area as territorial waters is antithetical to our strategic interests, contrary to the law of the sea and the like. And I think quietly and importantly, Russia has assisted in that effort. Third, I believe a natural partner in Asia for Russia is Japan. And I think we've had a number of attempts in the past to overcome extraordinarily difficult and tense issues of the islands. It's really not the position of the United States to interfere in those quiet negotiations. I think we've seen times in the past where it looked like we were making some progress. My hope is that over time in the coming years that the circumstances will allow for more strategic interaction between Moscow and Tokyo that will lead us to an avenue. And we talk about the end of the Cold War. Let's recall that formally the Second World War has never been concluded formally between Russia and Japan. That is not in our strategic best interests. We'd like to see a set of circumstances of an improving relationship between Moscow and Tokyo. And I think over time, taking prudent, careful steps in that direction, again, and we understand what's going on in the Ukraine, is in the best interests of all concerned. That's the third area. The fourth is we're entering a very difficult period with respect to U.S.-China relations as Chinese operations continue to extend beyond the first island chain. They're going to increasingly rub up against American forces forward deployed, right? And so our military assets and theirs are going to be operating in proximity much more than we've done in the past. To date, we have remarkably few institutions and capabilities that allow us to potentially dial back or resolve a local crisis if it occurred, right? And in fact, the only real examples that we have of mechanisms that were put in place to actually prevent miscalculation and escalation were erected during the U.S.-Soviet period. Incidents at Sea Agreement, Dangerous Military Activities Agreement, some of the protocol issues around Berlin. These mechanisms were put in place carefully, strategically to avoid miscalculation and accident, something that, frankly, we are living with on a daily basis with respect to the United States and China. I believe Russian friends are exactly the right vehicle to be able to offer advice and counsel to Chinese interlocutors about why establishing these mechanisms are in the best strategic interests of all concerned. And then finally, Sam, just to say, in fact, we had very productive discussions with Russian friends about the establishments of mechanisms associated with the creation of international organizations. You may not actually recognize it given how much we struggled during the Cold War, but when it comes to the ASEAN Regional Forum, to the East Asia Summit, Russia has been astute and effective at creating mechanisms that allow for more dialogue and more cooperation more generally. And I think that effort has been generally productive and helpful. I understand some of the recommendations that are being put forward about how to talk about other countries in Asia. I'd never miss a chance to underscore for Russian friends that they should be a little bit more anxious about China. I think it's an important element of our global strategy, and I think it actually happens to be true. And I think at a strategic level, it is in Russia's best interests in Asia to have a more diversified portfolio. And as importantly, I think it's in our best strategic interests. So I think over time, more official dialogue is both necessary and important. But in this period of time, I just want to commend again Sam and IISS for having this kind of framework and discussion that will allow for greater understanding between both sides. And I will say, I found Russian interlocutors extraordinarily open, professional, open-minded, productive, creative, and prepared to take some of those steps going forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Kurt. So we'll open it up. If anyone has a question, they can raise their hand, and we'll bring over a mic. We're here in the front row. Steve. And also, if you could just identify yourself before you ask your question.
Hi, thank you, Sam. I've got a question for each. For Kurt, I was wondering if you could give any thoughts about the future of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and whether or not that was one of those helpful institutions that the Russians set up in Asia Pacific. And Vasily, could you give any comments about China's One Belt, One Road policies? There seems to be some nervousness in Moscow about Chinese intrusions into Central Asia, but I'd be curious if you think so.
So I'll identify Steve. Steve Began.
Steve Began.
Sorry.
Still?
That's true.
Yes. Go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. Great questions. Look, I think, in fact, there was a period in time where the United States was somewhat ambivalent about the creation of these organizations in Asia. The SCO never anticipated having American participation, but there were a number of institutions like the East Asia Summit which we chose not to ask to enter. I think the driving force in the SCO was actually not Russia, but China. And I think my recommendation to anyone who's making Asia policy is that the dominant view of the United States should be if security, trade, strategic issues are being discussed, we want a seat at the table. And that our interests are to have most of the dominant institutions being trans-Pacific rather than Pan-Asian. And I think the struggle, Steve, over time is going to be between those two conceptions. And my view is that if we do this correctly, I think Russians are themselves worried that too much focus on Pan-Asian institutions might exclude them. And so I think we would have a natural ally in discussions around ensuring that the membership includes the key areas of the Asia-Pacific region, which include Russia, the United States, Southeast Asia, China, India, Australia, New Zealand, and others.
So yes, about this Silk Road. First, it's like an economy textbook. China is entering a new stage of economic development. Shift from export of capital to export of commodities to export of capital. The Silk Road is a basis for export of China capital. And how to do it? They chose, I think, a very efficient way. They come to any country and say, we give you money for infrastructure. You know, private business doesn't like to invest in the infrastructure. Government to invest in infrastructure means budget problems. So everybody welcomes. China invests in global infrastructure and so opens new markets for China capital. And also China prefers to use Chinese technology and Chinese facilities to create new railroads and so on. So it's another chance for China domestic production. So they try to increase efficiency of the economy and growth rate of the economy by implementing the Silk Road and maritime Silk Road that is very important also strategically. Because to implement maritime Silk Road, China needs good relations with Southeast Asian nations. So now about Russian reaction. It changed. From the beginning, it was very nervous because Russian officials saw a big competitor in the Silk Road project to Russian initiatives in the framework of Eurasian Economic Union. But now the situation changed. Russia and China signed an agreement about cooperation between Eurasian Economic Union and the Silk Road Initiative. Russia just very simply saw an opportunity to get new investments from China into infrastructure project. There are many problems in our cooperation in this sphere because Chinese won't give Russia money, but they want Russia spend this money for Chinese technology and Chinese facilities. But China wants also to give some orders for Russian factories, especially nowadays we have big problems in economy, so some orders for Russian factories could be helpful. Finally, I would like to conclude that the perception changed from negative to that, we can cooperate here, but the problems remain just inside the cooperation.
If I could just add on that note, it's been quite impressive to watch how effectively the Chinese have managed this problem. They've really taken steps to address Russian threat perceptions in such a way as to reduce them and proceed with what they were planning to do in the first place, minus resistance potential that could have been there from Russia. This May 2015 statement that Vasily referred to is really quite remarkable in that it clearly China didn't need it, but it went through the effort to engage when it did perceive that there were concerns about its efforts in Central Asia. So maybe just over here.
Thank you. I'm Priscilla Clapp. Following up on that discussion, when you see China reaching its arms around Southeast Asia rather aggressively today, do you worry that they also want to dominate economically or otherwise the Russian Far East, ultimately? Take the long view.
My personal position is, I think in a little bit different way. I think that China approach to South China Sea is very complicated. It's between two things. One thing, to strengthen its military presence and its political presence against American presence in South China Sea. But the other thing is that China, as I said, to implement its maritime Silk Road strategy, needs good relations with countries in the South China Sea, because ASEAN countries are the main route at the moment for the China maritime Silk Road project. So China policy is now maneuvering in this way, but I think that finally economic interests will be stronger than military security interests. It's also, this problem also is connected with what is going on inside China. inside China political elite, and you see what Xi Jinping is doing, his struggle with those military and political cadres who do not like what he is doing is strengthening. And sometimes maybe he has to just sacrifice. No, just the last session, generals openly, Chinese generals criticized him for that he did not increase military spending as much as they had expected to do, and so on. So about Russian Far East, yes, strong anti-Chinese feelings existed before and do exist now, but before, anti-Chinese feelings was based on the idea Chinese will come and take everything, Chinese people. Now it's unrealistic. They do not go to Russia, they go to America, to Canada. But now they say, oh, Chinese will come and buy everything. I don't know why dollars received from Chinese are not so good as dollars received from Americans, but such kind of perception does exist. So, and the reaction to such concerns is that Russia tries to balance relations with China and growing China influence in Russian economy, not only Far East but global, by trying to develop cooperation, economic cooperation with Japan and South Korea. Of course, we have problems on on these two vectors, but anyway, so this the idea exists, and the idea of balancing also exists.
So again, up here in the front row.
Jay Thompson with Chevron. Question is for Kurt Campbell. TPP came up from the other two panelists. If you were having a conversation with Russia's leadership about TPP and they asked you how, from Russia's perspective, how they should view the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what would be your headline messages? Opportunity, challenge, neutral to their interests?
Yeah. Should we take a couple of more questions, Sam,
Okay.
and then we'll open up? That's
Before you have to leave.
Yeah.
In the back there.
Thank you. Jeff Goldstein from the Open Society Foundation. A question for Vasily. Since the start of the 20th century, Russian foreign policy has periodically swung towards Asia. It's most recently would be late Gorbachev. But attention never stayed there. It always shifted back to Europe. Do you think that's likely to happen again this time, or do you see this as a more permanent change of priorities, and if so, why?
One more up here.
Mike Macetic, again to Vasily, sort of following up on the previous question. There was a session at Brookings last week in which Gordon Brown said that the high point of Russia-Chinese engagement was the Shanghai oil and gas deal, but that the Chinese keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and that the Russians are getting more disillusioned and sort of thinking, well, maybe our hope is not the Asian market, but going back to the European market. Could you just talk in the context of what Russia-Chinese negotiations are really like when these two get in the same room together?
So why don't we let Kurt answer
Yeah.
the question that was directed to him, and then
turn it over. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I just saw just a great question about negotiations. I think some people know that the longest negotiations of the 20th century actually were between the former Soviet Union and China. The border territories of the Amur River, almost 40 years on and off. And that will give you an indication of what maybe some of those negotiations must have been like as we go forward. The issue on the TPP, which is a great question, it comes up not only in conversations with Russia, but countries in Southeast Asia and with China as well. My general point initially is that before we start talking about new members or requirements for joining a second round, you got to get the first round done as well. And I think the politics are very complicated here in the United States. I don't think I can really add much more to it, but we have a growing set of concerns in both political parties about certain aspects of trade, and it will take real leadership and commitment to get this over the finish line. I was heartened by some of the comments that we saw from USTR Mike Froman a few days ago, and we'll see how that plays out, particularly after the election. I will say my own view about TPP as a process is I think other countries tend to forget that this is really not invitational. It is aspirational. And I think that at any point that the United States and other countries sent a message that you are not welcome to aspire to join TPP, that will undermine one of its most important functions, which is the concept of setting the bar for a set of, again, operating procedures and mechanism and expectations that we hope will dominate certain aspects of trade and commercial interaction in the 21st century. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Kurt. Vasily?
Thank you very much for your questions about Russia turning to the East 30 years ago and nowadays. You know, I personally participated in preparing papers for Gorbachev in 85, 86, in particular to his Vladivostok speech. But at that time, the global situation, economic and political situation was absolutely different from the nowadays. At that time, Russian shift to the east had different goals. The first one was to open Russian Far East for foreign investments. You know, by that time, at that time, the Vladivostok and many other areas were closed for foreigners, even closed for Russians. Russians had to get a special permission to visit Vladivostok city, and so on. So Gorbachev tried to open for investment, but the Russian economy was not market economy. It was command distribution economy, and it didn't respond to new opportunities. At that time, another goal was to push relations with not only with Japan, because until the end of the Soviet period, the only country which meant economically something for Russian Far East was Japan. China was weak, North Korea was a problem, with South Korea we didn't have diplomatic relations, and so another goal was of opening the Far East was to try to establish diplomatic relations with South Korea, because the Gorbachev government, contrary to his predecessors, did understand that South Korea is a partner and could be economically a very important partner. Now the situation is different. Now China is big, Japan is important, South Korea is also important, plus many other countries. So now the turn to the East is more economically determined. And Russia as a market economy, okay, maybe not ideal market, but still market economy, can use such new opportunities. So the turn to the East, as I tried to explain in my presentation, is determined not only by the worsening of the relations between Russia and Europe because of the Ukrainian crisis, but it has its own logic. New chances, new opportunities, new markets. Second question about this gas deal and so on. In my personal understanding, the deal was not prepared well. The problem of price wasn't solved finally. The problem of price, and that's why they didn't realize their plans in time. In principle, Russia wants to have a new big gas pipeline to China because it's a stable source of getting money, it's clear. But this pipeline technically is not linked with Russian gas pipelines to Europe. That's why it's impossible in one day just to switch our gas flows from Europe to China and from China to Europe. So again, it will not. This project will not be an alternative. It will be an additional project to Russia cooperation with Europe. There were some ideas how to link these two gas supplying systems turned to the Europe and to China, but technically I think it's not a very easy task. Maybe in the future they will be linked and Russia will be more flexible, but now what is for Europe is for Europe. I talk about gas supply. What is for China is for China. A new situation we will face when Russia develops a lot of LNG plants, and what Russia is trying to do now. LNG is more flexible; you can deliver it to anyway. But still, I do not think it will be a contradiction, because LNG more reasonable to deliver to countries with big access to the sea, because they use sea to deliver LNG. To Europe, Russia will continue to deliver gas through pipelines. So when what I am sure that the problem of price, Russia and China are partners, but Russian Gazprom is not ready to sacrifice with the price in exchange for some political reasons. So now it is not a political issue. I mean, the gas pipeline Russia-China project. It's more commercial, economic issue. Politically, it is solved. China needs it. Russia is ready, but Gazprom doesn't want to give gas for nothing.
I would just, if I could add one sentence, you know, in the context of this price environment, every single capital-intensive project on Earth is under pressure, not just this one. Over here, Gil. Actually, let's take three again. So, go ahead.
Gil Rosman, formerly of Princeton of the ASEAN Forum. Vasily, my question for you is, given Kurt's comments about the U.S. support for Russia-Japan agreement, what do you see happening at Sochi? Do you think that in a month Abe and Putin will make progress towards an agreement? And if so, what are the components that you foresee as part of such an agreement, including economic arrangements for the Russian Far East?
Jill, I'm very glad to see you and to hear you. Thank you. Yes.
Let's take a couple more. So in the back there on this side. Get you in.
Thank you. Hidetoshi Ozuma from American Security Project.
Sorry, from where?
American Security Project.
Uh-huh.
Excuse me, my paper dropped.
Can you speak into the microphone, please?
Okay. Regarding the U.S.-Russia security cooperation in Asia, how could the country address China's A280 security?
Yeah, понял. Yeah. And up here?
Yeah, Mark Tokelau from the Korea Economic Institute. With China's claims on the South China Sea as context, does China recognize Russia's vital national interest in Arctic waters, or does China argue for freedom of navigation?
China?
Yes. China sailing in the Arctic.
Russia's position on that?
Does China recognize Russia's vital national interest in Arctic waters, or does China argue for freedom of navigation for the Arctic?
You understand the question?
Yes. Sure.
Okay. So I can answer the
Я
second
не
one.
понял второй вопрос.
I'll answer the second. Go ahead. So, you take the first
Okay, Jill first, about Russia, Japan, and so on. I'm surprised to see in the United States so big interest to this meeting. In my view, and I am sure in perception of many Russian experts, it will be just a routine meeting. Japanese want it. But the problem is from the Japanese side. There is an opinion among the Japanese politicians that we witness a new disbalance in Russia-Japan relations, because it will be the third Abe's visit to Russia, and Putin didn't make any visit to China. So it's important for Japan side. And also about negotiations. Now the problem of the territorial disputes cannot be solved. Let me just remind that a couple of years ago, Russian legislation adopted a new law against separating some of the Russian territories. Now, even discussion of the idea that Russia should give some of its territory to other country, it's criminal, up to 5 years imprisoned. So general atmosphere after Russia returned back the Crimea is that how we can give something to somebody, including Japanese. I'm sure that Japanese understand the situation very clearly, but due to domestic political situation, Abe should show to his voters and to his political opponents that he continues to struggle, politically struggle, for returning part of the islands. But from economic point of view, the problem of sanctions. And now the sanctions are not so important and big, but they are symbolic, and Russian leadership does not like this Japanese decision to make sanctions. So if Japanese stop implementing sanctions, Russia will be ready for more cooperation. But what does it mean, more economic cooperation between Russia and Japan? Russian economic climate nowadays is the main obstacle to cooperation. Even if we have no political impediments, we still have this problem of Russian economic and business climate. So I do not expect anything from this visit, just maybe to show that we do not rely only upon China, but also we have other partners in Asia Pacific, so big and important, like Japan or South Korea and so on. Well, so the second question about Russia-Chinese relations.
I can answer that. Why don't you address the Arctic question?
Oh, Arctic,
Yeah.
and then return back to it. Yes, Russia is very interested in cooperation with other countries in the Arctic area, but on the other hand, Russia first wants to prevent its own interests. And Chinese also pay now big attention to Arctic area. You know, this Silk Road, Maritime Silk Road, Arctic Silk Road. But they understand that this needs a lot of investment. And theoretically, not only Japanese, also South Koreans are interested in the development of the Arctic route. Maybe I am wrong. I personally do not understand how it can be effective if it cannot work for all the year, but maybe there can be some economic reason when they use it for 6 or 7 months, or maybe 9 months, if to use this atomic ice breaker. Yes, ice breaker. Well, so politically here with China, we do not have problems. But when China becomes more active on the Arctic route, somebody in Russia becomes more cautious. But if China is more cooperative, just investing into development of this area, Russia accepts it. You know, the problem is that it looks beautiful on the map, but historically it was a route during the Stalin times, political concentration camps, and it was a route when in summer period the central government delivered food and clothes to these concentration camps located in the north. So infrastructure is awful, is terrible, and to make it really efficient, first the port infrastructure should be built. And if China says, or Arctic Silk Road, and we are ready to invest, why not? So it's basically more, in perspective, positive rather than negative expert. But at the moment, I think that the process, particularly of Russia-China cooperation and Arctic, is just in words, more in words than.
So in the report, the farthest we go in terms of discussing potential U.S.-Russia security interaction is recommending military transparency and confidence in security building measures. The idea that there could be some sort of direct U.S.-Russia cooperation on countering Chinese A2AD capabilities is, very much divorced from the current political reality of the bilateral relationship, sort of impossible to imagine today.
Similar to Russia-China Union, there were some stupid ideas expressed by some Russian politicians about Russia-China military political union. But alliance, yes, the union alliance. Mm-hmm. But first of all, China does not need it. It's their official position, and it's their real position. China wants to be independent player, equal to the United States, or as much as possible equal to the United States, equal to China, bigger, more important than China. So China doesn't need alliances at all, especially alliances aimed against the United States, because China, United States, in Chinese words, construct strategic cooperation of a new type, so better military exchanges, better security, and so they do not need this headache in the relations with America, headache because of this alliance, military alliance.
So let's take a last round of questions, if there are any remaining. One in the back there. Maybe that will be our last, unless I see any other hands.
This Silk Road, China Silk Road, isn't it result first of all, I'm not from defense or oil companies. I represent hospitality industry.
So your name and
tourism.
your
My name is Shahryar Ali Khan. Asian region. I come from Asia. The Silk Road is not. It's going to bring some of those infrastructure possibilities for that region. The roads which are being built, they come with no attachments, no do this and get this. There's no congressional approvals. And what is going to result is a massive internal tourism drive, especially now that Iran will open up.
What's your question, sir? Sorry to interrupt.
The question is that shouldn't we be thinking on those bases that there are possibilities rather than threats, the China Silk Road, and also advancing that region, which is going to be populated. Pakistan's population will be 300 million.
Got it. Okay.
And shouldn't we be thinking on those bases?
Thank you very much. So, Silk Road, more possibility and opportunity or more threat?
Challenge also. It's everything. It's a mechanism. China, if China succeeds, it will be good for China's businesses, also good for local businesses because infrastructure is improved. It's also a challenge because China will increase its economic, its presence in global economy and strengthen its global economic positions, and strengthening global by strengthening global economic positions, China will try to strengthen its political and security position. It's also an opportunity and a challenge. So it's a process where we can find positive and negative. It all depends how China will act and how other countries will respond, how they will cooperate, implementing the Silk Road. So opportunity and challenge as usual.
Thank you very much, Vasily, and thank you all for coming today.